and welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2021. I'm delighted to introduce in this session Pixium Vision. Now I'm going to read this because it's a company that specializes in bioelectronics and brain-machine interface technology. But you and I would know that better as bionic vision. And I'm delighted to have Lloyd Diamond, the CEO, here with me. Lloyd, hello.
Hello, Vivienne. Thank you for having me.
So, bionic vision. Let's just help everybody out at the beginning by just describing a bit about the eye. So we have light coming into our eye, goes onto the retinal cells, and there's a bit of a kind of relay race where next those light signals are then converted into electrical signals, and then everyday miracle, it's made into pictures for us by our brains. So that's what should go on, but in many eye conditions, the bit that translates the light coming in into those electrical signals doesn't work. Enter Pixium. Tell us how you aim to over this problem and how big a problem it is.
Sure. So Vivienne, it's true what you say. That's how the visual process should work. But in many people, especially those that have retinal degenerative disease, and just to put this in perspective, we're talking about 285 million people worldwide who are visually impaired, and about 200 million of those people have what's called age-related macular degeneration. It is a disease that affects the aging. A large percentage of adults over the age of 60 will have some form of this type of retinal degenerative disease. And what happens in that patient population is that the photoreceptor cells in the deepest layer of the retina do not function properly. They begin to die. And so, as you mentioned previously, the conversion process from light energy into electrical stimulation, which is done by these photoreceptor cells, cannot be completed because the cells are not viable. So in comes Pixium, as you said, with our bionic vision. It's quite remarkable what we're able to do. We have a small implant. We call it Prima. It is a 2 by 2 millimeter implant that's thinner than a human hair. And it's made out of a material that we call photovoltaic. To maybe explain it more in layman's terms, it's a material like a solar panel. So it's responsible for converting light energy into some electrical energy, which is what the photoreceptor cells are supposed to do. So our implant essentially takes the place of the photoreceptor cells.
Fantastic. And so if I'm a patient, what do I get? What am I equipped with? What does it involve me doing?
So there's really three components. One is the implant I just mentioned. So that's what's implanted surgically in a relatively straightforward surgical operation that takes about an hour and a half. Any retinal surgeon that is experienced in doing retinal surgery, of course, could do this. This procedure can be done under local or general anesthesia. So the implant is inserted, and then the patient goes home for 4 weeks. Implant is settled in place, the retina heals on its own, and then the patient comes back for the two other components that are required for the system to work. And those include a pair of smart glasses. Most people would be familiar with Google Glass. So these smart glasses that are proprietary to us, upon which we mount a small video camera, which goes on the side of the glasses where the implant on the implanted eye. So if, let's just say in this case, we implant the right eye, the camera goes on the glass on the right eye. And then that system is attached to a small pocket computer that the patient then can wear. It's larger than an iPhone, but smaller than a laptop computer. And that pocket processor is actually what houses the algorithms, the computer, and the light emitting technology that's required to activate the implant.
So it's really remarkable, and science fiction that's become science fact. And Who do you anticipate? I mean, we talked about a very large number of people having visual problems, but who do you anticipate this most being used by? Is it for the people who've got the condition called dry AMD? So the wet form is one for which there are quite a lot of medical therapies. Not great, but there are medical therapies. But dry, I think I'm right in saying that there's almost nothing there for them.
Correct. So it is the dry form. And when we talk about 200 million people, 80% of that 200 million have the dry form. And so for those 160 million people today, there is no therapy. The dry form is different than the wet form. You know, the wet form is a result of bleeding in the eye, which actually is what causes the visual impairment. The dry form is a degeneration of the photoreceptors, as I mentioned earlier. And so for those patients, this technology would be appropriate. Now, not all 160 million, because thank goodness that many patients will maintain sufficient vision even as they age to where they would not necessarily benefit from a retinal implant. But there are about 5% of all the dry AMD patients that have an advanced form of the disease called geographic atrophy. And geographic atrophy simply means that if you look at the macula of the eye and the retina behind the pupil, that part of the macula is no longer viable. It's actually, you can see it on a scan. It looks almost like a whitish color. And so geographically, it's situated centrally in the macula. That's why they call it geographic atrophy. For that 5% of the patient population, they theoretically could be eligible for our technology. But I want to maybe dig one layer deeper. So you have to have geographic atrophy, and then those that have no central visual acuity, meaning they have geographic atrophy, but they cannot see anything in their central vision, those patients would be able to receive our implant, and they certainly would benefit from it.
Have you started trials of this?
So we have 3 ongoing trials. We started a feasibility study in Europe, in France in particular, 36 months ago. And for those that are familiar with drug therapies, it would be the equivalent of a phase 1, phase 2 trial sort of combined. That feasibility study, we reported and published our 12-month data in the Journal of Ophthalmology in the US. We now have also issued a press release on 18-month data, and we're now coming up on 36 months. In that patient cohort, at the time of presentation, all 5 patients were considered legally blind. They had geographic atrophy in advanced stage, and they had no central visual acuity. Our 18-month data that we issued a communication around actually showed that of those patients, they all were able to significantly improve visual acuity. If you look at how we measure that on a letter chart where the patient will read a letter, largest one at the top, smallest letters at the bottom, and then we count the lines of improvement over a period of time. So let's say when they first got implanted, they could only read the first big letter on the first line. The best performer was actually able to improve 7 lines on a visual acuity chart. That is quite incredible. And in fact, if you look at patients with AMD, there is no therapy or technology today that has been able to show that level of visual acuity improvement. That's the first point. Can
I just stop you a second, Lloyd, just to say, how much difference does that make to a patient's everyday life? Because it's one thing reading the chart, we've all done that in the optician, but it's another thing, how does that translate into their daily living experience?
So theoretically, and I'm going to explain what I mean by theoretically, it should mean that they'd have the ability, for instance, to read street signs, to be able to operate a stove in their home or turn on a coffee machine. The feasibility study in France did not look at quality of life improvement or daily task improvement. It did look at visual acuity, and the way that you scientifically can measure that is through improvement in letter reading. In addition, those patients were also able to see, in addition to letters, sequence of letters and read words as well. Now, that being said, we've started now our phase 3 trial, which is called Primavera, and that's a pivotal study here in Europe. And that study will measure, in addition to improvement in visual acuity, improvement in quality of life, where we will ask the patients to do certain tasks, such as read street signs, turn on coffee machines, things of that nature, which theoretically then should be able to show us what the resultant improvement in quality of life means. So that's the second and definitive trial for European approval. The third trial, which is also a feasibility trial, which is ongoing now, is in the United States. We received approval to implant 5 patients there as well. We've now implanted 2 patients pre-COVID, and now with the pandemic, the study had been put on hold for several months, and we're now just starting back up again. We hope to have the other 3 patients implanted here over the next several months.
And what's patient response been to this? Because one of the things that's, this is not going to be a cheap product, I'm imagining. So one of the things that's going to be really important is patient pull and patient demand. What do patients feel about this?
At first, and I'm going to say of the 7 patients that we've implanted, it's you see the general sense. Pre-implantation, there's a lot of excitement. These patients have lost their central vision. They want to be able to read things, see their grandchildren's faces, things of that nature. So a lot of excitement. Immediately post-implantation, there's a little bit of apprehension because the system requires getting used to. It requires some rehabilitation before you're actually able to fully benefit from the improved visual acuity that you can experience. But what you start to see over the course of several months is as the patients are able to see lines, see shapes, see letters, you see this sort of enthusiasm where they want to do more. Oh, now I want to be able to, I don't know, sign a check, or, I want to be able to go to my favorite, baker and choose whatever, I don't know, sweet, be able to read it without having my significant other read it for me. Oh, and then when would I be able to see children's faces? So there's this sort of building excitement afterwards as well. What our patients tell us is they never thought they'd be able to see things again. And for the most part, this has gone beyond their expectation.
But there's a road to go yet, both in terms of expectation management for patients, but also in developing the system for a wider number of people.
For sure. And I think, we manage the expectations up front. We tell them you probably aren't going to be able to drive again, with this. We need to still make further improvements for you to be able to see people's faces, your grandchildren's faces. But, we'll get to a point where you might be able to recognize a facial expression. And, we'll hope that you can see street signs and things like that. So we really do manage the expectation along the way. The nice thing about this system is the Prima system is it's not just an implant, it's also the externals that I talked about. We can continue to improve, to be able to improve the visual experience through improving algorithms, image treatment capabilities outside of the implant itself. And that's what the company is continuously working on as well.
So once the implant is in there, it's the potential for improved sight really comes from the refinement of the algorithm rather than any changing condition in the patient.
Yes, that's true. The implant remains static. It actually comes from 2 areas. One is improvement in the algorithm, but 2, it's also the patient's ability to focus their gaze appropriately on the camera, which is what they need to do to be able to make sure the implant is activated. It's teaching their brain again to recognize the images that they haven't been able to see for quite some time, right? So it's sort of this multi-step process, which they learn through the rehabilitation process that we provide for them in the clinic. The one thing, though, as well that I should mention is, even though these are mostly older patients, we've been able to prove that the visual cortex in the brain remains quite plastic. They may lose use of vision, but the brain will quickly start to remember what it used to see. And that's been sort of part of the remarkable journey that we've been on with our patients as well.
But possibly they're not going to be fighter pilots.
No. But the great thing is, nor do they want to be.
So what does the timeline look for you now? Let's take us, over the next 5 years. What's the timeline for Pixium?
Sure. So what I would say is we expect by the end of this year to complete enrollment of our patients in the Primavera study. It's 38 patients we're targeting for our European pivotal trial. And then we'll need 12 months of follow-up. So by the end of 2021, COVID impact aside, happy to comment on that if you'd like, the COVID impact aside, we should have the data readout at the end of 2022. What that then means is we'll take the 12-month data, we will package it in our submission for CE mark. And then by the end of 2023, early 2024, we plan on market launch of Prima in Europe. So at which point we would be the first therapy device or other with an on-label indication for dry AMD.
And so you're aiming at that dry AMD market. It presumably, you said it's the first device, but do you anticipate any competition from therapies, from medical therapies for dry AMD? As I mentioned, they're not there at the moment, but there are a lot of folk trying to work on them.
Yeah, be completely open about it. 65 ongoing trials in drug therapy, gene therapy, stem cell therapy for the dry form of AMD. Many have shown promise. But then when they get to phase 2 or 3, they actually don't show any significant impact. We believe there's a world where medical therapy and our device can coexist. Those other drugs, therapies actually aim at either slowing down the disease or reversing them. We know in any event, at least over the next several years and perhaps 10 or more, according to the experts, we probably won't see a therapy that will have a significant impact on dry AMD. So patients will continue to progress in their disease. It's a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's or dementia. And so eventually the people will go blind. And we know that as the population ages, more people will go blind. And so we see a very robust market in the future, even in light of potential medical therapies, which might not be so close on the horizon, but nonetheless, we can coexist.
And you're a super cool grandpa if you've got bionic vision.
Oh yeah, and I tell you, our new generation glasses look really slick, so they won't be embarrassed wearing them.
You mentioned the impact of COVID. I mean, that's had such an impact on clinical trials, and particularly here because all these folk that you're dealing with are elderly and shielding.
Yes, the good news is that up until the Primavera pivotal study, we were still in feasibility phase. In Europe, we saw a little bit of impact, but not much impact because we're coming to the end of the follow-up period in that trial. In the US, as I mentioned, there was a delay of several months and we're back on track now. I would say this, that while COVID pre-vaccination was complicated for us, perhaps we're fortunate in that we're targeting an elderly population who are priority for vaccination. So too soon to tell if that will actually help us through this period, but we have a certainly hope that in our patient group that would be eligible for vaccination, it will certainly help give comfort for them to participate in these trials.
Now let's ask you some of the money questions here. What are the milestones that investors should be looking out for?
Yep. So the next milestone will be the final 36-month follow-up data on our French patient cohort. And we expect that it will only prove a continued, it will only show continued improvement in visual acuity and safety. That's the first milestone. Second would be completing the implantation of our patients in the US feasibility trial, and then the 6, 12, 18-month follow-up points in that trial, which we expect will only confirm what we've seen in the French patient cohort. There's no reason it wouldn't. And then we will announce when we implant our first patient in the Primavera pivotal study, which we expect to be able to do early this year in 2021. And then the next will be the main readout in 2022 of our Primavera pivotal data. So there's probably 5 milestones upcoming when we look at clinical results that investors should look at.
What's your cash runway? Do you have that?
So we've announced. So we've announced to the market we have a cash runway up to the end of 2021, and the good news is we have access to additional funding should we want to execute on that. That should take us through the end of the clinical trial readout period 2022.
And you've also announced a very exciting partnership strategy. So tell us a bit more about that.
So we announced in early January of 2021 that we are entering into a combination with Second Sight in the US. And not to get into too much detail, but perhaps the viewers might be aware of Second Sight. They were very much the leader in the retinal implant space for retinitis pigmentosa for many years. And they announced about 1.5 years ago that they actually were stopping manufacture of their Argus 2 product, which was an epiretinal implant for retinitis pigmentosa, and actually started to focus on development of Orion, which is a visual cortex implant focusing on neurostimulation in the brain. The nice thing about this combination is while we used to be competitors, when Second Sight changed their strategy to visual cortex stimulation in the brain, they also changed the strategy outside of retinal degenerative disease into treating other forms of blindness, such as glaucoma, as well as other forms of trauma and diabetic retinopathy, for instance. So from one day to the next, Pixium and Second Sight became very complementary. And it just seemed like the natural step for us as both having ambitious missions in trying to restore vision to the blind, which, by the way, is a mission that no other company really has today. I say this as an aside, many ophthalmology companies, a lot of exciting development ongoing, but to say that you want to restore vision to the blind is a very ambitious mission. And with Orion and Prima, we actually have the possibility, if both make it to market, to do so. And so for us, strategically, this combination made sense. Secondarily, we're 2 independent companies, 1 product company each, combining efforts, opening up ourselves here at Pixium to the potential to access US public markets through a listing on NASDAQ through Second Sight, was another important reason to do this. So, for all those reasons, we're excited, and this is really a win-win for both Pixium and Second Sight.
This is obviously not going to be a cheap product. It's going to be quite costly. Do you imagine that this is something that's going to be available through insurance systems, or do you think that this is essentially a private purchase?
So I can only speak from history. There's precedent for payment in this space. Both Pixium with its first generation technology, Iris, which competed with the Argus system I just mentioned from Second Sight. There was European reimbursement established, paid through the public payment systems in Europe of €100,000. And in the US, Argus enjoyed through CMS, Center for Medicare, through the public insurance there, $150,000 of payment, as well as private insurers followed suit. So we know that there's precedent and an appreciation for the health economic outcomes that are result from giving somebody autonomy and the ability to see again after they've lost their sight. So we're very, very hopeful and positive that with Prima, certainly we'll be able to show a significant improvement, as we've already done in our earlier studies, in visual acuity, quality of life, which will demand the appropriate payment.
Lloyd, I want to finish by asking you how you feel at the moment, because 2020 has been an extraordinarily difficult year for everyone, personally, professionally, at a local, at a national, at a global level. But I wonder how optimistic you're feeling right now.
I'd say we were optimistic even in 2020. We're optimistic in 2021. I mean, of course, the pandemic has affected many people. It's affected employees. It's affected frontline healthcare workers. It's affected our patient population. And so we felt the difficulty with them. We shouldn't forget that, the patients we're targeting are older, and so they really have suffered a lot through this process. But the company, we believe, in 2020 did an excellent job maintaining its financial runway. We accessed the various financial instruments that were available to us that were made possible through the generosity of the French government and our ongoing and long-term investors. So 2020 for Pixium was actually a good year, aside from what I just mentioned concerning our patients. I think 2021 is going to be bright for us. We've started, as I said, our Primavera pivotal study. We're one step away from commercialization now. Our pending combination with Second Sight is going to open a new chapter for us and our shareholders, and also create opportunity for potentially future shareholders that up until now have not been able to enjoy the progress we've made at Pixium. So we are extremely positive and optimistic, Vivienne.
Well, I don't think you need bionic vision to say that actually the future is looking bright for Pixium. Thank you so much, Lloyd, for talking to us. It's really appreciated.
Thank you, Vivienne. It's been a pleasure.